Greetings and welcome to Black Religion Books, the official podcast of the African and Diasporic Religious Studies Association. Find out more about us and what we do at ADRSA.org. I am your host, Iya Funlayo, PhD, the founding director of the ADRSA, and I am delighted to be here today with Dr. Elizabeth Pérez, who is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the author of two books, which we'll be discussing today: Religion in the Kitchen and The Gut. Welcome, Dr. Pérez.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today, Iya.
Oh, it's always wonderful, wonderful, wonderful when we get to connect with one another. And as I've shared with you before, I am so thankful for your work. It has been really instrumental in mine in several ways. And I'm just excited to dive in and to share with our listeners all of the great ideas therein. I
That's
want to
music to
start
my
us.
ears. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I want to start off today by just asking you to share a little bit about yourself, a little about your background, where you're from, where you went to school, and what inspired you to want to study Africana religions.
Whew. Well, I was born in New Jersey. Both of my parents had immigrated from Cuba in the late 1960s, from a part of Cuba that is not often shown in the media, which is the southeastern Cuba, Guantanamo. Um, I spent my first 10 years in this tri-state area, very much interested in the kind of immigrant community scenes in New Jersey and New York, and just everything there was to offer there as a kid. And my parents moved then to the Miami area, actually a little north of Miami, to Hollywood, Florida, when I was about 10. So they wanted to be closer to family, which made a lot of sense. And so when I arrived there, I was more in the mix, you could say, of a kind of Latino and indeed Afro-Latino kind of ambiance, part of which was actually these religious supply stores called botanicas. And so I would see these botanicas going to visit relatives, and I'd be so intrigued because of the packaging, the images that were used on the bottles and the soaps and the floor washes, and how people use them. And then side by side with those sort of things that sort of have more of a kitsch aesthetic, there would be these statues of dark-skinned African deities alongside Catholic saints. What is the relationship there? And my own family, there was nobody who had been initiated. I would come to learn much later that my mother's side of the family was active in Espiritismo before I was born, and indeed before the revolution, 1959. But that I didn't grow up knowing about what happened behind closed doors. I was acquainted with the representations of the practice. And for example, also in Cuban music, you have references to orichas, you have references to the saints, but in a key with an African beat that you're aware that there is a double or triple or quadruple meaning there. And so that led me to become more curious about Afro-Cuban religious traditions like Lucumi, like Palomonte, like Abacua. And then when I was able to study in college, I was really interested in traditions where women had a large role to play, in religions that were either led by women or gave women voices. And I found coincidentally that in fact, in Afro-Caribbean religions and African-derived religions, often women are the hub of the community. They have an equal voice. Their bodies are regarded as sacred, and in fact, in some ways, the template for what it means to be a human being who serves the divinities or the great creator deity. And so that combination of different factors led me to want to specialize in these traditions in graduate school.
Wow, wow. I'm so just delighted to see all those places where we converge in terms of, a lot of my own interest in spirituality came through growing up in Harlem and seeing, in Spanish Harlem particularly, and seeing botanicas and being curious and always wanting to go in, but having a family that wasn't acquainted with those traditions or wouldn't have taken me there, and also the desire to see more representation of women and to understand where we fit in, especially having grown up Protestant, where we don't even have the Marian devotion that Catholicism has to bring women in. It's really all, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all male and energies, although the gender of the Holy Spirit could be debated, but that
Oh,
type of thing. And so we both have that in common, and so it makes sense, of course, that your first book, Religion in the Kitchen, focused on the domestic sphere of the kitchen. Right, I got mine too, focused on that sphere where women rule, right, where women are the ones who are in charge of that space. And subsequently, you point to that as a reason why the kitchen has been unexplored often, and domestic space more broadly, as a site of inquiry around religion. Talk to us a little bit about that and how your desire to highlight women's roles led you into the kitchen.
so, I mean, I think for most of your viewers now, they thinking back, maybe not to their own nuclear family, but to previous generations, the kitchen was definitely a space where women would display their care. It was a place to demonstrate their love of their families by trying to anticipate what they wanted to eat, at what time, often delaying or deferring their own meals because they're cooking for the kids or they're cooking for their spouses. And it's also a place where people gather, and they often, though they don't gather in the same linguistic registers necessarily as they do around the dinner table. The kitchen is where people, they tell secrets, they tell things that maybe we have to lower our voice and make sure that, is anybody in the next room okay? And because it is in some ways, it is a less privileged space. So it's an important space, but it's not hierarchically as respected because it has been the domain of women. And then, so I'll add an asterisk there, which is that I found doing my research that many Lukumi kitchens are not just women led, but they're also led by gay men. And so it's a queer space as well. And if they don't dominate in the sense of they're calling the shots as to what way the foods will be cooked for the deities, they add their own flavor, they add their own humor, their own flair. And this is not in some ways, I don't want your viewers to think that I'm stereotyping, but there's a way that we have to account for the fact that gay men are valued, that their presence, whether it is aligned more with a feminine center presentation or that's like a masculine gay male presentation, either way, I have seen many kitchens that either have an alache, a cook, who is a gay man, or where the kitchen is in some ways powered by their labor. And so this was one of the these were some of the pieces I wanted to put together in the book, is to try to formulate a kind of framework for thinking about these things that had never really been spoken, in part because as Afro-Cuban Lukumi wanted to move away from stereotypes of Santeria, practitioners were very careful about the way that these traditions were rendered in print, to try to get away from stereotypes around sacrifice and blood and possession, which had been so sensationalized. And so it was a very delicate process for me to think about um, describing the meats that are eaten or that are presented to the orishas, as well as to delve into, what happens in that space between the stove and the countertop, as people are washing dishes, also cleaning, doing all those things that seem, like menial, quote unquote, unskilled labor in so much of our society, but things that are vitally important for the continued growth and reproduction of these traditions.
Wow, you've said so much just in that. I zoned in and felt it when you made that distinction between the kitchen table or the kitchen and the dining table, right? The dinner table, where we often think of the dinner table, particularly when we think of state dinners or royal things, as these
Mhm.
seats of power and this place where people of power come together to make decisions and to discuss things, whereas the kitchen is that space of laboring, right? Is that space of telling secrets, is that space of care in many ways.
And also, not to interrupt, but I think that's why the kitchen table has been so important for Black feminist work, right? Kitchen
Yes.
table press, all of the art that's been created around the kitchen table, the way that, kitchen table conversations, citing so many, I would say precursors for me in writing. So always wanting to acknowledge and to cite that when I try to reflect and document those things that I see in the ethnographic space, that others, and often Black feminists, are the ones who have come to the fore and preceded whatever I'm trying to say.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we lift up all of those voices who have highlighted the kitchen table as that space and understood the place of power that existed, especially for Black women in these spaces, in the space of, colonial Cuba, the Americas, where it was really not only a women-led space, but a Black women-led space in particular, and a place of extreme power, right? When we are, even though it has been, as you said, sort of denigrated or devalued as
Mhm.
unskilled labor, it takes a lot of skill to cook, and particularly to cook for the gods. And you point out this idea of, knowing, for example, which foods go with which deities and which parts of which foods are to be given to the deity, and some of the anxieties that can arise when things get mixed up, or if
Mm.
someone who doesn't know what they're doing, right, under the guise or thinking that they're helping, comes in and moves something or does something in that regard. Talk to me a little bit about that, because you note that your exploration into this study came from really observing these things that were going on in the kitchen, listening to these conversations, and you break the book down into sections of kitchen work, kitchen talk, right? And so talk to us a little bit about that aspect of the skill that's involved, of the ways in which the kitchen is this central space to the reproduction of the tradition and the maintenance of it.
Yeah, that's it's a vast question. So just to preface what I'm going to say by pointing out that um, the traditions about which we've been speaking are initiatory, right? And so they're generations upon generations of people who can trace their lineages back to enslaved people in Cuba and then in Brazil. Also, places like Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, and some others. We also have the example of Haitian Vodou. Again, a thriving tradition um, that was maintained through rites of passage. Now, in trying to solve this mystery in a way, that why in certain places had initiatory traditions been able to take root and prosper, and then in others they had, I don't want to say fallen away, but they'd receded, or they'd had to make different kinds of accommodations, especially with Protestant Christianity. It didn't seem adequate to me to give the answer that had often been given, which is that, well, these places were colonized by Roman Catholics. And so the presence of the pantheon of saints, or the cult of the saints, it facilitated dissimulations, it facilitated masking or disguises of the African deities, and that's why these places were able to keep their traditions alive. I think that's a piece of the puzzle, but I had to reflect that actually these were also traditions in which the initiatory traditions are traditions where the gods get fed, they get food, they literally, and Zora Neale Hurston says that, right, that real gods require blood, to paraphrase, right? And the vitality of that and the centrality, there's not a lot of discourse or theologization about sacrifice in these traditions, but there is this consistent practice that is full of protocols, rules of doing things. It's the farthest thing that you could think of from a frenzy, right? Because everything is so methodical and has to be thought out and has to be implemented. And so that led me to just even recognize what was going on in the kitchen as a graduate student as a ritual, because in the rituals that had been written about by the mid 2000s, 2004, 5, 6, the kitchen rituals were not present. But the longer that I spent in the kitchen, the more I realized, oh, actually there is a process for everything that is analogous to other ritual processes, but has its own temporality. It has its own rhythm. And there is, keeping with that metaphor, there's a choreography of the way that the body has to move in those spaces. And so I, again, then was asking myself, what connection is there between that kitchen space and the trajectory of a lot of the people with whom I spoke, especially my main interlocutors. And thank you always to Ashabi Mosley, the name that I call my main interlocutor in the book, and Tunde, her spouse, for letting me do this work in Ile Laroye. Thank you, thank you. What is the connection there? And I was able to observe that in fact, the more kitchen work that folks did of a very taxing, strenuous variety, the more likely people were to actually get initiated. And so it's sort of this double movement where as people worked and exerted themselves and sweated and became sore on behalf of the Orishas then were also working through them in order to create bodies that could sustain these initiatory traditions as they have been over the centuries. I mean, it's a little, the timing of that, the periodization is a little fraught, because some people will talk about, well, Orisha traditions didn't really take root in the same way in Cuba until 18 something. But nevertheless, it's a pretty impressive period of time in which you can think about people of West and Central African descent having been able to reconstitute these traditions almost out of whole cloth, because they weren't able to bring their ritual objects with them to the Americas. All they had were their memories about how the gods wanted things to be done.
Of course, that embodied knowledge of food preparation, right, for the gods, and the ways that that is such a central practice. And as you note, and is such a powerful observation, that those who actually do the work, those who actually feed the gods, those who actually learn the things that they like and don't like, are the ones who are most likely to continue with the rest of the processes. And it's really important that, as you point out, we often think about the things that happen in the kitchen as being on the periphery, or as being adornments or asides from the actual rituals that are taking place in the shrine rooms or in the initiation spaces.
Yeah.
Many not recognizing that if those things that happen in the kitchen don't take place, even often well before the full ritual starts, that they're not, the rituals themselves, the other parts of the rituals wouldn't be possible.
Exactly.
Mm.
That's another form of, we could say, socialization of younger people or junior members of communities, is the fact that at certain points in time, all of the initiated people, the lion's share, have to be helping with something. And so there is a sacrality. I would say there's a sort of spectrum of sacrality, because the kitchen for me is a sacred space. It does not have as many taboos, you could say, as the space in which someone's receiving a shrine, or actually being initiated, where they are being consecrated as a vessel for the spirit's energy. But junior people in the community really are very important.
No, extremely. And that is an important note, that the kitchen is one of those spaces where those who have not yet taken steps into initiation are allowed to be, and can be of help, and can render their service
Yeah.
in a different way than some of the other spaces that require initiation first.
And this, what you just said, helped me remember another point that had fallen back in my mind, which is that when people are in the kitchen, often they will talk about why they got initiated.
Mm,
So it's not just the physical labor, but it's the fact that you mentioned there's a chapter on talk, and that these narratives, the stories that people tell, especially about getting sick, especially about how their lives were falling apart, everything was going wrong, and as they tell the stories, they take a lot of care to show that they are rational, that they tried other options, that they pursued other avenues, they went to doctors, they consulted with other kinds of experts, but nothing could help except for the orishas.
mm,
So for me, that also, it pinged with other stories that I read in oral histories from other traditions, in which practitioners also said the same thing, whether it's a Brazilian person, a Jamaican person talking about their practice, um, throughout the diaspora, even in traditions like Espiritismo, people talk about the healing powers of mediumship, or the healing powers of the deities. And so that, to me, also was another piece of the puzzle, is the exposure to a kind of what we would call discourse around
mm-hmm.
what the orishas can do, the fact that they heal, they give life, they give zest to your life, they reinfuse your existence with hope and passion for living, which is as important as I think the other pieces are.
Absolutely. And you took me right to where I wanted to turn us, because you have two beautiful quotes that highlight this connection that you just made. One that says, to feed the gods and to speak of them is to make them real to others, right?
Mm.
To share those stories and to be cooking for them in the process makes them real. Tell us a little bit about that, in terms of, well, actually, before you do, let me add this other quote to it, because this also speaks to what you just mentioned. You said that in the midst of seemingly casual conversations, elders recount and model the gradual acquisition of hermeneutical apparatus that renders incidents and sensations intelligible as messages from the spirits. So that goes into what you just spoke about, in terms of coming to understand the events of our lives and reviewing them through this
Mm.
lens of interaction with the gods. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So, yeah, to address the last quote first, because you've been so kind in saying that my writing's accessible, but this is a moment where you have to sometimes use these words. But interpretive apparatus, or hermeneutical apparatus, is exactly a lens, like you say. It's a kind of lens. It's a filter. It's a framework for understanding things. And so, if your framework is a secular one, let's say, you're not going to appeal if something negative happens. You're not going to necessarily appeal to morality, that did you do something wrong, that you're getting punished, or that the maybe you need to pray more, or something like this. No, you're not, you're probably going to just think this was bad luck, or not even bad luck. It's just an accident. Some bad things sometimes happen. That's all. And being in these spaces, as people tell the stories, they acquire this lens where they start to see the connections between their bodies and the deities. And so Sometimes people who have stomach problems are told in divination, this is Oshun. Oshun is talking to you. You need to pay attention. And she wants you to feel good. She doesn't want you to have those stomach aches. So maybe you should cut down on X, Y, and Z depending on the Odu, the divination verse. You need to eat certain things and not others, but also to recognize Oshun's role in your life. Headaches associated with Obatala, or something happens to the legs, there's Elegua. So the heart, Ogun, right? So being in these spaces trains people to make those connections with the deities. Now, as a scholar, I'm not necessarily theologizing in the sense of saying, well, this is good or bad, or adjudicating like an ethicist, is this what people should do? But it's just the reality of this social space. And so feeding the deities then, and speaking of them makes them real. What I wanted to get across is the way that the Orishas materialize in everyday life, which is sometimes a concept that's difficult for us to grasp, because if we Google Orisha, we're immediately going to get all these images. We're going to get these AI constructions, often gorgeous constructions of what the Orishas look like. And I think they can be very instructive pedagogically, because it shows the blackness of these deities often. It demonstrates their splendor and their radiance, and their implements that they use, often their animals that are associated with them, or moments in their life that are illustrated. But on the other side of the coin is that when people get initiated, they have to get past all that to see that the sacred energy that they have received manifests in their bodies, not in the bodies of, this Ken doll or this Barbie doll, right? But that they have to find out what that means for them, to allow that energy to heal them, and then to also be a conduit for that energy to others, right? And so when I talk about the deities being made real, it's to acknowledge that sacred energy is immanent in any or every object, but that it also flows through bodies, that it also, for those who are initiated, it's believed that Ashe, or that spiritual energy, it flows through speech, through the saliva and the air that comes out of our bodies and connects with others, even though it's invisible. And so I was getting at something, on the one hand, that is a sociological, or it's a social scientific observation, but it's also a recognition that what it means to materialize is not necessarily available to our senses, that the materiality of this tradition is in the discourse, and it's in the acknowledgement of that energy being available, and that speech and action both are able to circulate it.
So powerful and so important, as you note, to bring the tradition, especially, we as people seek to re-enter these traditions, they're having to recalibrate in so many different ways. They're having to learn knowledge of things that they perhaps didn't have knowledge of before. They're having to pick up language that they might not have used before, whether that be Yoruba, whether that be Spanish in the case of certain houses that they may be going into. And they have to, as you're saying, bring the idea of the spirits down from this space of ideology into actual practice and into connection with them. And one of the very important things that you do in the book is coin this term micro practices, right? Of which you classify the cooking and the talking as micro practices that help to ingrain the tradition, that help to make it real, that help to pass it along. And this is the place where I will thank you again, because this is something, that concept of micro practice was so helpful to me in looking at Obi divination, kola nut divination, in the practice of Orisha traditions, which also has been similarly unexplored, and partially because it's largely women's
Mhm.
space. It's largely something that takes place in the domestic sphere. And it also involves this aspect of embodied practice and ingestion, as typically people will ingest the kola nut after using it, right? And so this idea, the ideas that you speak about and the way that you speak about them in this book, and particularly this idea of micro practice, is so central and salient to that. Tell us a little bit about that. Expand on that for us, and where you came to think
Yeah.
of it in that way, or to coin that term for it.
Yeah, I wish I could take full credit for that coinage. I will say it derives from the work of this historian of ideas, Michel Foucault, um, but it had not really ever been quite convincingly broken down in a way. It's a term that surfaces in different works of his, translated from the French. But in a book chapter in this forthcoming anthology, Critical Terms in Religious Studies, it's actually a second edition of Critical Terms. I explain a little bit better that it's sort of, even to trace back what term was translated into micropractices is a little tricky. So I picked it up just thinking this is really fascinating, because I think of things like drum rituals as a kind of macro practice. It's a big event, and it's a fixed event that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so a lot of rites of passage are classically like that, where they have it's kind of like a catalyst event. Then there's a certain kind of flow that is fixed, almost like a story, beginning, middle, end. Micro practices are more diffuse. They're happening here and there. They're kind of happening also in interstitial spaces. So temporally or time wise, they're a little they're less marked. And it became useful for me because the kinds of stories that people tell often are regarded as being within the genre of like chit chat or gossip, or you know we're just like chewing the fat kind of a thing. It's idle chatter, right, which is also associated with women very often, right? Gossip being one of those truth telling genres that are associated with women for different reasons. um, or to bring it into more of an LGBTQ space, it's the kiki, right? It's the kind of informal get together where you connect, that has not really been seen as that important. And it might not go on for a very long time. And so I was trying to make this argument that actually, even though these events are not durable, they're in some ways ephemeral, that they are consequential, they are significant. And so that term micro practices became uh, something that people have taken up that I didn't anticipate, honestly. I didn't realize would resonate with people, but I guess that there are so many things in other traditions that are analogous that it wound up being useful, which is fabulous. And so I continue just to be grateful that folks read the book and were able to open my eyes to the fact that there are other similar um, things going on. That's the thing about practice. My chapter in this anthology is just on the term practice, and it's a term like if somebody asks you to write an encyclopedia entry on doing, like what does it mean to do something, right? So it was difficult, but I brought it back to micro practices because it helped kind of guide my way through the literature about that.
Wow, yeah, that's so important. And yes, I will reiterate that it has been very important for those of us working in the field of Africana and other indigenous religions. And I think one of the things that makes it so salient is that it points out this piece that you point out in terms of this hierarchy of the senses, right? This place where within particularly Christian ideology, that has been the kind of hegemonic way of thinking about religion and religious practice, the most important thing is what you think or what you believe or what you feel in your heart. Whereas in indigenous practices, it is often typically what you do, right? So we don't say we're thinking about Orisha or we believe in Orisha. We say Olorisha. We have Orisha. We serve Servilwa. We serve the spirits, right? There are these even the verbs that we use in terms of our interactions with spirit revolve around practice, not so much around what we think or
Yeah.
feel about them. And that goes to what you say that micro practices do. Another wonderful quote of yours, you say that micro practices are engaging in them helps to mobilize emotions ranging from delight to disgust as a means of cultivating highly valued states and sensibilities, right? That it is through doing that we are changed. It's
Yeah.
through doing that we then take in these sensibilities. And I think that's just so beautiful.
Thank you again. I mean, I owe also my, in some ways, being sensitized to these things to the fact that I was part of a community where the Orisha, at the head of the community, the patron Orisha of Ashabi mostly is Alegwa, the trickster, right? And often accidents happen in ritual spaces, whether it's you're plucking a bird or you're butchering and something spills. And when I think about disgust, or when I think about the range of things that people can experience, um, how this is all under the umbrella of religious practice, and that the kinds of emotions and the kinds of, in some ways, like the shadings, affectively, we would say as scholars, they all conduce to, in some sense, replicating or creating the kind of, um, you can say, capacious imagination that practitioners in the past had, that our ancestors within the religion had, but also the kinds of bodies that, again, are become proficient. They can execute these kinds of very difficult tasks. Now, this is not to be ableist, because I want to say that not everyone is able to do everything in these religions. There's some people who can dance, some people who can sing, people who can drum, others work well in the kitchen, yet others are great because they can go out into the world and they can run errands during a ritual, and they can hit 7 stores in half an hour because they need something, right? So it's just to say that the way that emotions work in these spaces, I think, had been a little under theorized, and hadn't been brought up. That also there's a whole range of different responses. There's not one ideal response. There's a kind of orchestration, because these are human beings who are working. We're not machines. And if we're doing work that we feel is a bit disgusting, I mean, I'll just use myself as an example. I'm mostly vegetarian or pescatarian, but my kids eat meat. And just when I'm making hamburger for them or cooking steak, I have like a kind of weird reaction. I dislike it. I have a resistance, but we've made a certain decision. I love them. I want them to find this food tasty, right? And so it's a kind of analogous process when people are asked to cook for the deities. They just have to develop this capacity to do things that they find distasteful, or they wouldn't choose to do them, but they do them out of love.
And I think that's especially salient because often we are dealing with people, and I'll speak for myself, having come from an urban space, right? Being from Harlem, being from Jersey, you weren't raised on a farm, right? Where even the idea of butchering animals or being as closely engaged with the process of food preparation, like we're used to it coming to us sanitized and packaged in a certain way that we can't utilize it in the same way in this sacred space and in this religious space. And so it's challenging us not only to learn the practices of the cooking itself, but also to experience our foods and the things that we're preparing in a different way than we have previously experienced them, which can be challenging, right? And as you state and come back to, which also determines oftentimes whether people can continue in the practice, whether they are able to align themselves or shift themselves in such a way, not only with that one thing, but with all of the sensibilities that come in practicing the tradition. And that's where I think it'll be great to turn a little bit towards your second book, and because the topics are so interrelated, and of course we'll continue to weave them together. But there is this place, where you talk in both books about this sensory hierarchy, which is a part of what we're discussing right now, and this place where you speak about how thought and vision are lauded, whereas taste and ingestion and as well emotion, right, which is also associated with the gut and gut feelings, as you note, are placed at the bottom of a hierarchy. Expand to us, those who may not be familiar, about this hierarchy that you're speaking of. And you really encapsulate it so well in the first quote that you share in the gut, where you say that if religion is the head, then the gut, if the head is religion, then magic, the gut is magic.
Mm.
And you do so much in just that small statement. Tell us about that and about how that speaks to this idea of sensory hierarchy.
Ooh, thank you again. It's a great prompt. So I'll start just by noting that different cultures have different ideas of what is beautiful, what tastes good, what feels good, and then also what senses are to the fore, what senses are more dominant. And so if we look at the archaeological record going back thousands and thousands of years, um, it's it's interesting to note that the art looks really different, and the art does not necessarily privilege a what we would call a realistic rendering of the human body. But that might be, though, because those cultures conceived of visuality differently. Visuality and like how even you're looking at an object. It always strikes me that when we find statues of figures that are they're they're interpreted as goddesses, right? We're looking at them like they're straight on, but maybe they weren't used like that. Maybe they were looked at from the top down, right? There are so many different possibilities. But just setting that aside to introduce that notion that some cultures are more attuned to sound, then sound and vision seem to be among the most important. And evolutionarily, you could see why that would be the case. Um, there is an emphasis in our culture and in our present day Euro-American culture, and you could say kind of it's a globalizing sensibility that has taken hold, that has been described as ocular centrism, that all of our senses in some ways, they recede except for vision. Vision is so important to us, how things look, whether that's about movies and the fact that, the visual advertising has such a huge role to play in people's lives. Um, but sound in other cultural spaces is actually more important than visuality, and their people's languages reflect this also. So you can kind of track this with um, the way that languages might have a lot of words for different kinds of sounds or smells, right? And smell is a great example because it's among the most visceral of the senses, the olfactory sense. But we don't have a lot of language to describe different scents. So when you read about, if you're reading perfume reviews, people say it smells like this, that, and the other, right? But the vocabulary that we have in English for describing scents is not as intense as Southeast Asian languages or East African languages, right? So there's a way that the privileging of sight that took place over many centuries in the West, quote unquote, so Europe and those, you could say, ideological frameworks that it exported to the Americas, to Africa, and elsewhere, they privilege sight because of a kind of evidentiary paradigm, this idea of like seeing is believing, right? And it's even in some ways you can look at the Bible and, you know, there's the doubting Thomas, and he doesn't believe Jesus is risen or that it's really Jesus, but he has to see the hands and the wound in the side, right? So there's that paradigm that seeing is believing, that hearsay is actually less reliable. You can't trust what you hear as much as what you see. And this has been then coupled with another hierarchy, which is this notion that you know, the what happens from the, let's say, the eyes, the ears, and our thought processes, that those are closer to God on the one hand and reason on the other than what we taste and what we smell and what we touch. Okay. And so, funnily enough, you know, that part of the picture, it really, in some ways, you can say it crystallizes in the post-Reformation period, where philosophers for the first time are philosophizing without direct reference to what God wants or the centrality of God to the universe. And they are taking man with a capital M as a kind of, you know, the sun around which philosophy revolves, and trying to think about, well, you know, what are the different ways that man can have encounters with beauty or encounters with different sensory stimuli that will be ennobling or that will lead man to reason. And taste was actually discarded as a sense that it was so, in some sense, fickle. It was so unpredictable and idiosyncratic that it didn't really rank as a aesthetic experience that could really be philosophically valuable. Whereas seeing art, right, or looking at a beautiful, sublime landscape, that was actually more worthy of philosophical investigation. To some extent, sound, but again, you know, we're in already an ocular centric space in, you know, the late 1700s, early 1800s, right? And so those two, I would say, you know, strains of the question that you're asking kind of are interwoven to diminish taste as important. And we already made the connection between women and food preparation, right? And so the fact that women are preparing food, it's often people of African descent already. You know, we're talking about the 1700s, that they, or people who are on the lower end of the social scale, peasants, indigenous people, et cetera, who are actually growing crops and harvesting, that also works to diminish the importance of the manual, you know, touch and you know, if we look at specific philosophical texts, we can always find exceptions. And so I'm wary of painting with such a broad brush. But, you know, the next thing that we're going to talk about, I think, is about West and Central African sensibilities, right? Which are very much opposed to this model of, you know, the visual being everything, because it's so kinesthetic, it's so based on sound and motion. And, you know, that ties in with the gut, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what you're speaking about points to the exact reason why Oyeronke Oyewumi coins the term world sense, right, as opposed to worldview. So even this idea that when we call people's ways of experiencing the world worldviews, it points exactly to that valorization of the visual and what was sought to undo that with the term world sense, in recognizing exactly what you just said, that there are so many ways that we experience the world and that it is important to privilege them all, especially as we're talking about Africana religions, where we don't, again, just think about or believe in, right?
Mm-hmm.
We ingest, like, even as we go through ritual processes, ingesting things and tasting them, sometimes being not so pleased with the taste, right? And doing it as ritual is a part of how we interact with the deities as well as gain these sensibilities within the traditions. And
And
so,
often, oh,
yes,
sorry.
please. No, please.
I was just going to say, often in initiatory spaces, people are told, close your eyes, right? Close your eyes. And, you know, it's about kind of creating, yes, a certain kind of interiority, we can say, a certain kind of, sensibility, because you want to remove the expectations that you have when you're looking at something. But it is, I think, also a redirection into,
Hmm.
the other senses that often we don't pay attention to as much.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, so important, the work that you do around this. And you talk about the gut brain, right? So turning, as you said, to Central and West African sensibilities and this place of gut feelings, of intuition, of those being places of intense knowing and being centralized and important. And even, in my work, as I talk about Ori in the Yoruba philosophical tradition, which is talked about as the head and which does center the head, but also exists in other parts of the body, including the gut. There is Ori in the gut, there's Ori in the feet. Right. So speaking about decentering the head and moving down into the gut and thinking about that gut brain. Talk to us a little bit about that gut brain and some of those Western Central African sensibilities that you bring forward.
Yeah, so one of the provocations that I have in an early section is to say that, we have Western medicine becoming attuned to, there's a whole new field of neurogastroenterology that recognizes that the stomach is in some sense a second brain, that sends signals throughout the body, and that kind of communicates with, the brain that is at the top of the brain stem, or the spinal cord, this kind of, super highway of information, that we have. And it's not for me to, sweep away the head, because that's not going to take us anywhere, right? But to say that, if we look again at language, we look at the words, that people have for thought. And this gets tricky, because I don't want to assume that present day linguistic practice maps on easily to pre-colonial moments, right? As if, languages and peoples do not change, on the continent of Africa, every year, especially, every year, every day. We're not going to say that something 100 years ago stayed the same. But there were really, eye-opening moments that I had in my encounter with the scholarship. And, it is mostly, a book in which there's some ethnography, but it's more archival, because it was written during the early phases of the COVID lockdowns and so forth. Um, but to see that there are so many words in especially West African, but also some Central African languages, that tie the stomach to thought. Now, not just gut feeling in the sense of intuition or instinct or emotion, but literally processing information and wisdom in the stomach. That for me was really interesting, because, when we think about gut feeling, it's often in the sense of a hunch, that we have a presentiment that something is going to happen, or something's good for us or bad for us. So there are all these memes and all these social media posts about trusting your gut, right? Um, but the kind of African contexts that I believe were precedents for Afro-diasporic religions, if we look at those specifically, you can see the tie between, the stomach and other, parts of the abdomen, whether it's the liver, or the kidneys, how they are seen to have a role to play in cognition, right? And so that's an extra piece, that kind of added to this puzzle of why, these questions that arose for me of, why are there these foods that are made from intestines for the spirits, that are so sacred, that are foods that are really only made in the context of initiations? Why is it that we have the linkages between these parts of the body, and so many divination verses, right? So many, whether it's Ifa, you've already mentioned, Dilogun, you have so many mentions of the intestines, of the internal organs, foods that one should eat or not eat. And then also the stories that, especially in Cuba, have been told, and among practitioners of Lukumi, about the ancestors bringing their tools of divination or their consecrated objects in their stomachs from the coast of West Africa to Cuba when they were enslaved, somehow expelling them and then using them to found communities, to actually, in the case of Ño Remigio Herrera, known as Adechina, somebody who is said to have carried over the tools of Ifa divination, and been able to use them to become a Babalao and train Babalaos in Cuba. This, for me, tied very much back to the linkages between the stomach and thought that I elaborate in the book.
Yeah, that was so powerful. And to me, you spoke about the carrying of the objects of the stomach and in the stomach rather, and the carrying of the memories in the mind, right? So it's really points to, I think, the integration of the two. And part of the issue that we've seen with a lot of so-called Western thought is its desire to not only create hierarchies, but also to create singularities, right? Where we are only dealing either with thought, or we're dealing with emotion, or we're only dealing with the mind, or we're dealing with the gut, when the reality that you so beautifully point out, and that I think Africana traditions embody more broadly, is that it is that bricolage, right? That it is a combination, that we as human beings, we're not only head and gut, we have to eat in order to live. Right. So of course the stomach is an important site, because that is literally the place from which we get life. That's the place where we're connected to our mothers in the womb. It's the place, right, that if we do ingest something that's not good for us, the stomach has to know that and get it out quickly. And all of these different ways that those things work together. And then of course, as we see these things, we can see this isn't something I should ingest. Right. So it really, I think, beautifully celebrates the both and nature as well of African thought, as well as the ways in which our practice and our interaction with the divine also mirrors the body that has all of these different processes going on at one time and isn't a result of any one of them.
And if I could just add, I think even to say both and, that our minds go to, it's a binary, right?
Right.
It's binary, this binary thinking. And for me, it's the connection is the relationship. And this is what, as you know, Africana traditions do so virtuosically, is that they really focus on relationships as sources of life. And that relationship between head and gut is what I'm trying to restore. And again, it's not the binary. It's about them being in a certain kind of relationship. And in fact, it's a relationship that I would argue has been largely lost due to colonialism and its effects, that these are West and Central African knowledges that have been retained by the religions, but that unfortunately are only seen in traces in non-religious life, because, you said, well, it's that knowledge of a food that sits ill with you, that you have to expel it. But so many of us are accustomed to just ignoring these signals, ignoring the knowledge of our stomachs, ignoring
Or suppressing them with drugs, as we do with so many things now.
I mean, right, suppressing them. And I make the point that these are not, I'm not essentializing people of African descent necessarily as sort of like the carriers of this knowledge, like it's some kind of, it's necessarily that piece. I'm not saying is necessarily some kind of biological inheritance, but that there is this wisdom that has been learned by generations of people, because their elders train them to see the connections, to learn the divination verses, to I talk about, I quote Todd Ramon Ochoa on the tradition of Palo Monte, and how his mentor, a yaya in Kisi, or and a female elder in Palo Monte, trained him to see the kalunga, the ancestors or the spirits of the dead, in all kinds of bodily sensations, right? And so we lack that in everyday life, except for in these religious traditions. And so this is sort of like the tentative kind of argument that I have around retentions or survivals, is that unfortunately, a lot of this wisdom has not been retained, because there are these other forces, ideological and otherwise, at play.
Right, right. And of course we know that we can't talk about any of this, and we won't go into it, but of course we know that power and domination are, of course, such central characters in all of this, and central characters in the singularization of how we relate to things, because you can only dominate if there's a single stream to dominate, right? If we recognize the broadness of things, then there are too many places and too many things to try to control at one time. And so that whole process of narrowing things down as opposed to broadening them, has to do with power and control. And so it's really wonderful, and I appreciate having our minds re-expanded, having our senses re-expanded, having ourselves re-expanded to really appreciate and take in all of the different ways in which we process knowledge, all of the different ways in which we interact with the divine. And so appreciate both of your works in helping us to do that. It's been a beautiful, wonderful conversation, and I'm so thankful that we've had a chance to explore both of your books as well as all of these trains of thought that we have gone on to. You mentioned the anthology that you're now working on, and I want to ask if there's any other thing that you have on the horizon that you'd like to share with us right now.
So I'm happy to say the anthology will be out there, and I always link my work, whether it's articles or book reviews, to my own book reviews, to my website at UCSB. I'm happy to say that I was chosen as a Vona Voices Fellow for this summer for writing poetry. So it's
Oh
not
my goodness, I love that.
even academic. I mean, it is academic in the sense that the same concerns that animate my scholarship are present in the poetry, but they have not yet released the fellows cohorts. But I'm excited to be able to spend a week working on poetry, and that's also kind of been a vocation of mine. And I, I'm trying to kind of, in some ways, quiet the voices that always are coming up, like, why don't you write about this? Isn't this fascinating? This new thing happened. Why don't you write about it? And just kind of settle and try to think about the verse and the sort of poetic aspect of my writing practice.
That is so lovely. Well, I definitely look forward to experiencing some of your poetry, and wish you so well with that. And I believe in giving folks their flowers, so I just want to mention as well that I didn't mention earlier that both of your books are award winning. That the Religion in the Kitchen won the 2017 Clifford Geertz Prize in the Anthropology of Religion. That The Gut won the 2024 Leonard Norman Premiano Book Prize on Vernacular Catholicism. So I want to congratulate you on those things as well. I think it's particularly powerful when we are exploring traditions and writing on traditions that have been less explored and celebrated in the study of religion, and are celebrated for that. And so I really want to just, say congratulations again, and thank you again for everything that you shared.
I mean, I couldn't be more grateful for the opportunity to talk to you, and to hear all of these, I mean, wonderful things. There's really nothing better for an author to hear. And I'm also really excited about your work on Obi Kola. And I just invite you to share whatever you have with me, as it, the book is in manuscript form or any other form. It's really truthfully something I'm eagerly anticipating.
Thank you. And I absolutely will. I really value your input, and I'll look forward to us continuing to connect as we move forward. Thank you again. Thank you all who have been with us, whether watching or listening. Again, please do visit adrsa.org to find out more about what we do and information about how to connect with Dr. Perez, as well as links to her books, will be in the show notes. Take care until next time.